Hello and good morning, everybody. It is me, Julian, and welcome to the Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. The title of today's session is The Philosopher as a Fool, which you could also title The Madness of Modern Philosophy. And what I'd like to do in this short 30-minute lecture is give you a basic introduction to Slavoj Žižek's conception of what philosophy is, and by means of so doing, to talk about what the role of the philosopher can still be, i.e., what is the task of philosophy. And Žižek gives a pretty simple definition of this. He says, philosophy begins as soon as we refuse to accept what exists as given. And what I'd like to do with that is talk a little bit about Žižek's influence here, because Žižek essentially embraces the idea of the philosopher fool, the philosopher madman. And this is an idea that he takes from Lacan, who contrasts the idea of the happy shadow, or what he calls the fundamental fool, with the figure of the knave. And I'd like to also use that to then link back to Marx's idea of bourgeois ideology, what Lacan characterizes as knavery, and perhaps link it all the way back to Plato and his rhetorical distinction between the sophist and the philosopher. And then if there's still a little bit of time left, I would like to take that idea and apply it to Žižek's critique of ideology, and perhaps also his argument about ideology and cinema. So it's a lot to fit into 30 minutes, admittedly, but I think we can do it. Thank you to everybody who is joining me live today, and thank you to everybody who supports this channel, both by being a follower or a patron. If you'd like to download my complete guide to Žižek ebook series, you can still do so on my Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/Julian Philosophy. Okay, let's jump right in. So everybody who's familiar with Žižek's work and his public persona knows that Žižek has an eccentric personality. It's kind of a role that he plays when he's giving lectures or doing interviews. He's highly outspoken. He courts controversy. In fact, he says that his favorite maxim is to adopt the Sartrean stance, which is to say, Sartre said that you know an expression is true if it manages to alienate and upset either side of the political divide equally. Which is to say, Žižek never tries to simply speak to one group to say what they want to hear. Instead, he comes up with characteristically counterintuitive philosophical positions that upend the very idea of the easier, comfortable truth on both sides. This makes him a figure of scorn. It also makes him a figure of mockery. And some people have even suggested that Žižek plays the role of sacrificial fool. I would argue against this, in part because I don't think that Žižek would endorse the idea of sacrifice as being a good thing. In fact, as a Lacanian, I think Žižek would be highly suspicious of the idea of sacrifice. Lacan always said that there is something hidden within sacrifice, a secret surplus enjoyment on behalf of the one who stages a sacrifice. In fact, when Žižek writes about sacrifice, he says that the ultimate sacrifice should always be one that is totally meaningless. Like, instead of this grand heroic gesture by which you give yourself up for the other, you would simply disappear and throw yourself off a cliff and sacrifice yourself not on behalf of the other, but simply for the sake of sacrifice as such. This might be a slightly nihilistic take on sacrifice. Hence why I think that the idea that Žižek is a sacrificial court jester, a sacrificial fool, to my mind doesn't quite ring true. And yet clearly there is something in Žižek's persona and how he approaches philosophy that is radically different from the image that we have of the sage, of the wise man, of the sort of male philosopher who speaks wisdom. In fact, Žižek is entirely anti-wisdom. He's very Hegelian in this sense. Hegel polemicized against wisdom as being a kind of false oratory, that wisdom pretended to say much but ultimately said nothing, like little aphorisms that meant very little but felt good to consume. In a sense, we could imagine Hegel looking at the world today, a world that is completely full of aphorisms. You rent an Airbnb and there's platitudes hung on the wall, etc. And Hegel would have been very outraged by this. Against this, of course, the Hegelian aphorisms always are very meaningful, but make completely no sense unless you already understand Hegel's theories. Like, essence equals appearance, the true is the whole, etc. Like, it doesn't mean anything on the level of common sense, which was exactly the point for Hegel. And so Hegel appears to many as this mystical fool, as this solipsistic madman. And that here we see, I think, already the kernel of the idea of the philosopher as fool for Zizek. Of course, many would point towards Diogenes, I think, as sort of the original philosopher fool, the one who exempts himself from society, who speaks from a position of peculiar privilege, if you will. But I'd like to briefly introduce, before we sort of loop back to antiquity, I'd like to briefly introduce Lacan's distinction between the fool and the knave. Because Lacan puts it quite succinctly. He says that the fool is a happy shadow, as he puts it. He's naive, he is innocent. He walks through the world, but he doesn't really know how it works. In this sense, he can actually tacitly undermine it. In fact, in the same way that the ancient Athenians used to argue that the barbaroi, the foreigner, could tell truth to the native population because they were outside of it, Lacan argues that the fool is the one who can speak truth to those who are immersed in the dream of ideology, etc. For example, I recently saw the wonderful film Mon Oncle by Jacques Tati. Incredible a film from 1958 in which we have a fool character, a kind of clown-like figure who lives in a rustic, quaint, slightly dilapidated part of Paris, who isn't really good for anything, but he's a very good person. He's childlike, he's naive, he's loving, he's nurturing, but he's also looking for a job. And he encounters his brother-in-law, who lives in a mansion full of modernist furniture and gadgets and appliances, and he tries to navigate this new world of consumption and industrial progress, and with a kind of bewildered amazement. It's a comedy. It's sort of classic slapstick. It's like watching Mr. Bean or Charlie Chaplin or Buster Keaton. And yet in this very stance of the fool, the idiot, the naive, innocent soul, he is able to tacitly undermine and expose the vanities of the petit bourgeois, of the aspiring middle classes, who, with their self-cleaning carpets, or self-cleaning kitchens, are able to signal to themselves that they have made it. It's a wonderfully sharp and yet very funny, quite biting satire. It's called Mon Oncle by Jacques Tati. It's actually one of my favorite films. I was very excited that I got to see a film projection of it recently here in Santa Monica. Anyway, Lacan basically argues that the fool, therefore, is someone who speaks truth. Like, he isn't integrated into social life. He doesn't dream the same dreams other people do. And in this naive stance, he is actually a radical figure. It's a little bit like Zizek's favored maxim from Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, I would prefer not to. The I would prefer not to, the kind of self-exempting from life, also makes you an idiot. It makes you a fool. It's not a rational thing to do. And so Lacan celebrates the fool as the ultimate figure of truth, as the ultimate philosopher. In fact, in a sense, he's already going back to Plato here, but I'll get there eventually. So Lacan juxtaposes the figure of the fool with what he calls the knave. And he says the knave is the person who is fully integrated into social and professional public life. He says most intellectuals are actually knaves, which is to say they pretend to be dumber than they actually are. He says this is required of them. Like, they have to play the game. They have to follow the rules. They have to know when to speak and when to shut up. And they dress like professionals. They conduct themselves with great dignity and serenity. They are no fools. They are reasonable men. In fact, he says that they ascribe to a kind of stupidity, which they call realism. And Lacan basically says, and he's quite explicit about this, he says, the left-wing intellectual should therefore always aspire to be a fool, to be on the side of the happy shadows, the supposedly naive, idiotic ones. Whereas what the left-wing intellectual should avoid at all costs is to become part of the salaried class, part of the group of people who pretend to be realists and yet in so doing essentially allow themselves to act as if they were dumb, to simply participate, to privately believe one thing, but to publicly do something else. In other words, Lacan basically argues, although he's not as sort of crass as this, he basically argues that the public intellectuals of our time, the ones who strategically present themselves as figures of wisdoms, are in fact nothing but knaves. Whereas the true, if you will, speakers of truth are those who are unafraid to be seen as fools or idiots, who are unafraid to be misunderstood, who essentially aren't trying to do the respectable thing, who court this very misunderstanding. Now, of course, there are limits to this juxtaposition. It's not, it's a formalism. It's not something I think that we could easily apply to everything. In fact, ironically, if we took Lacan's juxtaposition between the fool and the knave and we turned it into a piece of content, here's how you know that you're a fool, here's how you know that you're a knave, it would itself become a form of knavery, I think. Instead, what I'd like to do is I'd like to take this idea of the fool versus the knave and contrast it with Plato's well-known distinction between the sophist and the philosopher. So Plato basically argued that the central divide within the pursuit for truth, like the task of the philosopher, the war, the two sides, as it were, was between the sophist on the one hand and the philosopher. And the sophist at the time was a figure who essentially taught rhetoric, who sold strategies of how to turn around your life, how to present yourself well in public, how to be successful, how to be respected by your peers, make friends, be attracted by women, etc. You could say, it's a simplification of course, but the sophists had essentially become self-help philosophers of their time. Now, it's important to note here that Plato's being a little bit unfair, because if you read the philosophy of the actual sophists, it's full of philosophical wisdom. Like, even if you think about Zeno's paradoxes, there's an enormous amount here that is actually hugely philosophically important. In fact, if we take a step back from this divide between the sophist as the wisdom peddler and the philosopher as the figure of truth, we can actually see that the one leads to the other. Which is to say, what sophism accomplishes is that it essentially undermines the idea of certainty and truth. It basically says what we speak can create a reality which is itself quite real. One of the sophistic maxims is that if you speak the word carriage, a horse-drawn carriage will literally appear in your mouth. Now, the simple way to dismiss this is as a form of manifesting from antiquity. Speak gold and you shall receive it. But there's a philosophical principle underneath it, which is to say, I think that we should actually rehabilitate the sophists a little bit. We should give them a little bit more credit. The sophists were essentially positing a theory of reality, by which reality was more important than divine or idealist essences. Plato, however, being a great systematizer, resented not only the way in which the sophists had essentially monetized their theories, but perhaps above all, secretly, underneath or through the lines, he resented the fact that the sophists were undermining the very fabric of the godly and the material as such. Hence, personally, this is my theory, I think that Plato actually emerges as a great systematizer, as someone who tries to impose back upon the sophists a kind of system of idealism so as to diminish their impact on his philosophy. Now, but on a simpler level, he's basically polemicizing against sophists as self-help teachers who aren't really engaged in philosophy, who simply are trying to make people more well-adapted to the status quo. And it's always interesting to me, and I don't know if you share this, but it's interesting to me how similar this polemic is to today. Thousands of years could go by, but it still feels like there is fundamentally a divide between philosophy as a process of truth that is unpopular and that divides and creates confusion and, the kind of inaccessible philosophy versus the sophists who are really good at presenting their ideas very simply, who are celebrated and sort of cherished by the general public as being these incredibly wise figures. Now, personally, I don't think that we need to create such a stark divide, but the point that I'm trying to draw out here is that the sophist is the one who knows how to present himself. He's integrated into social life. In fact, his entire philosophy is suited towards being successful in life. The philosopher, on the other hand, inhabits this tricky position, which it is, of course, altogether too easy to romanticize, of being an outcast, of being an outsider, who does not fit in. In fact, his very truths are unsettling and uncomfortable. Now, I want to be cautious here because I don't want people to believe that if they simply ostracize themselves, they are a philosopher. That if they are a contrarian and let's say that they don't have a life of meaningful participation, that somehow this makes them a philosopher. Like, this is why I'm always a little bit suspicious of the way in which Diogenes is celebrated. Because the truth is that the very idea of exempting yourself from life and crawling into your barrel and simply being this hermit-like figure is itself a fantasy, which is to say it's a symptom, I think, that is overdetermined by the alienation of social life. And so to me, the real question, and apologies for the aside, but to me, the real question is, how can this figure of the philosopher as fool nevertheless be somebody who creates community, who is able to speak to others, to educate themselves and each other? Because the idea that you could simply be the fool who retreats from social life to live in your barrel, I find to be slightly ideologically suspicious as well. In fact, we could look towards the billionaires of the world as Diogenes-like figures who retreat into their private mega yachts and islands and who spout lyrically about what the world is really doing and who prepare for the future, etc. And so I would always caution, I would always warn against Diogenes, who somehow in his very seeming foolery appears to me perhaps even a knave, perhaps even a figure of tacit ideological submission. But you may disagree, and that's fine. So Lacan basically comes up with this juxtaposition between the knave, the one who is altogether too good at presenting themselves as dumb and therefore being successful in the world, versus the fool, who isn't necessarily smart, but who doesn't desire to be seen by the other, who is naive and innocent, gullible, in fact, in many ways. In fact, there's, I think, something quite powerful about allowing ourselves to be naive, about simply sort of walking into the world unafraid to be taken advantage of. Something childlike, if you will. Now, what I'd like to do here is make the transition to ideology, because the word that we haven't really addressed here is ideology. Lacan's basic position, after all, is that the knave is somebody who can read the ideology of the present moment and adapt himself to it, therein becoming successful. The sophist makes the same claim. He says you can essentially twist your words, you can use rhetorical tactics to speak in a way that you say what people want to hear, and this will make you successful. In other words, you are conforming to the ideological constraints of your given moment. And this idea of ideology, which Zizek has popularized, seen through a Lacanian lens, really derives from Marx's critique of bourgeois ideology and morality. Marx's basic argument is quite simple, but I think helpful. His basic argument is that the bourgeois class, which emerges sort of amidst the rise of capitalism and industrialization, the bourgeois class tries to present its way of life as natural, as timeless, as simply how it is. In other words, to exist as a person, you have to start acting like a bourgeois. You have to start thinking of yourself as a bourgeois, someone who knows how to sell themselves and present themselves, who speaks in a certain way, who is reasonable about their decisions, who invests in a way that makes sense, etc. Everybody becomes a bourgeois. Even the worker likes to think of himself as a capitalist in this sense. And Marx's argument here, I think, and the part that I think is actually quite powerful, is because it's not at all cynical, I think, is that this means that the bourgeois casts the world around him as being thus. In other words, the bourgeois says, I am successful because I am the most well-suited to how life is. This is simply how it is. Like, for example, if you look at self-help theorists, for example, including Jordan Peterson, although by now I would suggest he's something much more depraved than simply a self-help theorist, present the world in terms of the life lessons we can learn from the animal kingdom, natural hierarchies, consider the lobster, etc. And this is one of the fundamental tenets of bourgeois ideology. They say, look at the natural world. Look at how the world is. Can't you see that we are simply acting in accordance with nature? This is simply what men do and what women do, etc. This deeply normative, ideologically infused take on reality is subsequently, or perhaps retroactively, posited as being the simple expression of a timeless truth, of common sense, as it were. And one of the arguments going all the way back to Plato is that common sense is never actually common. Common sense is always the reflection of a contemporary hegemonic position, which is to say, what appears to us as common sense is in fact the sense of the powerful, who wish us to see the world in a certain way, who have learned to speak to the public, to the masses, in a way that seemingly embraces the idea of intuitive sense, and yet behind the scenes masks all manner of ideological manipulation. We can see this today in our politics, I think, in which extremely reactionary positions are expressed as being supposedly simply common sense. But let me not lose the point here. The point for Marx, therefore, is that the bourgeois creates a reality in which the bourgeois appears as the pinnacle of historical and natural evolution. Hence, anybody who refuses to live like the bourgeois does becomes an abomination, becomes not worthy of life, essentially. And here we have the really dangerous and dark aspect of bourgeois ideology, which is that anyone who doesn't conform to it becomes thereby a threat, and their very way of life is seen as threatening. And you can see this, I think, even on a very small level. Like, if someone has spent their entire life trying to present themselves in a certain way, they can feel strangely threatened by somebody who doesn't see it that way. Like, let's say that somebody decides to go and read a book at the library. The bourgeois will say, why are you reading it? What's the advantage you can derive from it? What valuable information have you gleaned from this book that allows you to get a leg up in life? And then if that person says, well, actually, I'm reading a novel, the bourgeois will get very threatened. They may even be violently against that person. Think about this strange thing I've been thinking about this strange thing I've been thinking on the internet. This incredibly reactionary division that men aren't supposed to read fiction, that men read nonfiction and women read fiction, because women are creatures of fantasy and whimsy, whereas men are rational-minded empiricists who want to derive information from these valuable books that they can then implement in their own corporate strategies. It sounds like a joke, but it's reality. I mean, that's true for most bourgeois ideology. It sounds like a sick joke, but it is entirely true. Against this, the fool is the figure who doesn't correspond to such ideological fabrications. The fool does things in their own way. In this sense, of course, the fool is also a fantasy figure. It is very difficult to be such a fool. In fact, it is probably entirely self-destructive to be such a fool. Hence why we need these figures of the fool in our literature, in our art, in our cinema. The fool who is able to undermine that which exists by means of sort of engaging with it naively. Now, I'd like to briefly conclude by saying that Zizek argues, therefore, that philosophy, like how to be a philosopher, is to refuse to accept what exists as given. And this is essentially what the fool does, which is to say, Zizek posits that the way to be a philosopher is to be a fool, what Lacan calls a happy shadow. To be somebody who looks at the world and essentially tries to understand the structural incentive structures. That's a tautology, but I hope you know what I mean. Like the structure, not the content, which is to say, instead of looking at what the world is, trying to figure out how the world works. And the fool is therefore somebody who is unafraid to look like they're doing the thing wrong. Like, if somebody asks you, if you're studying philosophy and someone says, well, what are you going to do with it? Here we have the ultimate bourgeois question. How can everything you do in your life somehow be utilized so as to create increased surplus profit for yourself? And the sad thing is, with the absence of safety nets, this is not an entirely unreasonable question. How are you going to live? How are you going to make money? How are you going to save yourself? This becomes a predominant question. And one of the, I think, and as an aside here for a moment, I think that a lot of people who study philosophy actually run into this, which is that the more philosophy they study, the more difficult it becomes for them to adapt to social life, to the expectations of the bourgeois ideology. And yet they realize that this is a very dangerous thing. In fact, when Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth, I really think you have to see it in those terms. He wasn't corrupting the youth by inciting them to rebellion. He was corrupting the youth by essentially inciting them to refuse to accept what exists as given, which is a tacit kind of rebellion. Once people stop buying into the dream disappears. And that's what the powerful fear the most, that you will stop dreaming their dream as if it were your own. And so once you start studying philosophy, I think there's that moment where you start wondering whether the incentive structures that underlie most of social life and what people define as success is in fact deeply suspicious. In fact, perhaps even itself a trap, that even if you were to become successful in the way that other people believe success is defined, you would not be happy. You would in fact have become what Lacan called a knave. And I think secretly, maybe a lot of people feel like this. Like a lot of people who would achieve what is supposed to be outward success actually feel like a scam. There's so many videos about how people are very successful and then suddenly they realize it isn't what they actually wanted. And so personally, I think that what's beautiful about philosophy and what's beautiful about being the fool is that paradoxically it gives you a kind of freedom. Like it gives you a freedom to live with abundance. It gives you a freedom to live fearlessly. It gives you a freedom to give yourself to others completely. There's really nothing so powerful as truly submitting yourself to someone. And by which I mean to really say, I will fight for you. I will really love you. I will give myself to you without any sort of further consideration. For me, the ultimate figure of the fool is always Luffy in One Piece, the manga and anime. Luffy is a fool. People laugh at him all the time. And yet he gives himself completely to everyone until they realize that in his foolery, he is completely earnest, that he is the most serious man precisely because he is so silly and goofy, that he takes his goofiness extremely seriously. Whereas most people who present themselves as serious don't really believe in it. Like secretly, they don't fully accept the character that they're playing. And I think that this is a kind of alienation that can be really difficult to have in your life. It's something I struggle with as well. I mean, it's not easy, I think, to walk that divide. And for Hegel, this is the figure of the master, which is to say, the master is a figure who isn't the sage, the wise man who tells you how to live, Instead, the master is actually closer to a fool. Christ, in this sense, is the ultimate fool. Christ essentially willfully gives himself to the Romans and is crucified for it. And then, in so doing, appears to expose God himself as a kind of impotent fool. It's an extremely disruptive act, especially for his disciples, of course. And yet in this, he essentially is able to overcome the figure of the sage, the figure of the savior. He becomes the redeemer precisely because he cannot save himself. I think it's an extremely powerful idea, really, really powerful. And so once again, it's not about sacrifice. I don't think sacrifice is really the right word for it. I think redemption is the right word for it. In fact, from a Hegelian point of view, the master isn't the figure who sets other people free. The master is the one who is so recklessly, abundantly free that it inspires other people to be free as well. It's not that their chains are severed by someone else. It's that suddenly their own internalized chains disappear. And to me, that's what revolution is. Revolution isn't about storming the barricades, etc., or manning the barricades and storming the Capitol. Sorry. Revolution is this kind of internal revolution. It's being able to free yourself from all of the self-imposed restrictions that you have slowly been encouraged to place upon yourself and that are slowly strangling you. And I'm not telling people how to live. This is something that I struggle with. I struggle with it as much as anybody else does. And so to me, the answer, and this is just my solution, is to say philosophy, therefore, is the communal process of helping each other be free and trying to give each other the information and the tradition, for that is also what it is, of this process of setting each other free. And to my mind, that's something that doesn't happen overnight. It can be a lifelong process. And I think that when we read texts and when we read books by other people who have gone through that process, it tacitly helps us do so as well. And so I don't believe that it's something that can be done in isolation. And perhaps today, to be a fool, therefore, to be a philosopher, to be a madman, is precisely to say that this is what we're going to do. We're going to practice and teach and learn about philosophy without thinking about how it makes us money and without thinking about how it can give us the outward appearance of success. It's not easy, but I think it's important. And ironically, I think that this is where joy lies. I think this is where we can find true satisfaction and true joy in ways that can be surprising and profoundly transformational. That is my lecture on the philosopher as fool, a happy shadow, as Lacan puts it. I promised to talk a bit about cinema. I briefly talked about Mon Oncle, but I will continue this conversation in our Discord. If you'd like to support this project, please do consider becoming a patron. As a patron, you can download my recurring ebook. It's basically every 3 months I post an ebook, and you can download these lectures as audio files as well. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and attention. I will see you next week.